On the afternoon of August 17th, the air in Brookfield Park carried the easy warmth of late summer. It was the kind of day where the sun clung to the sky just long enough to stretch shadows across the grass, and the small-town playground echoed with the light-hearted noise of children's laughter. Among the families scattered across the park was 29-year-old Danielle Rayner and her 2-year-old son, Mason. Neighbors knew Danielle as attentive, always keeping Mason close. That day, she was pushing him gently on the swing, her hair tied back, sunglasses perched on her head. Witnesses remember Mason's giggles carrying across the open field, his small legs kicking the air with each push. It was an unremarkable moment in an otherwise ordinary day, until it wasn't. People who were there say nothing seemed unusual in the minutes leading up to their disappearance. Danielle spoke briefly to another mother at the park, mentioning she planned to be home before Mason's nap. She checked her phone once, then slipped it back into her purse. Around 2:45 p.m., she was still visible, helping Mason climb the small plastic slide. By 3:05 p.m., they were simply gone. No one saw them walk toward the parking lot. No one remembers hearing a cry or commotion. One family sitting on a picnic blanket recalled glancing up and noticing the swing set empty, the stroller still parked nearby. At first, they assumed Danielle had taken Mason to the restroom, but minutes passed and there was no sign of them. By 3:15, a strange unease began to ripple through the few remaining parents. Danielle's stroller sat beneath the swing set as if she might return any second. Her purse was hooked over the handle, its zipper half open. Inside was her wallet, keys, and a cell phone that had already begun ringing, her sister calling to confirm dinner plans. In the stroller's cup holder, a small juice cup rested, still half full, beads of condensation running down its side. Mason's sun hat lay on the ground a few feet away, faint grass stains marking its brim. When 10 more minutes passed without a sign of them, one parent walked the short trail toward the restrooms and returned shaking her head. Danielle and Mason were not there. At 3:27 p.m., a call was placed to the local police, reporting a mother and child missing from the playground. Officers arrived within 6 minutes, their patrol car parking beside Danielle's silver SUV in the lot. The vehicle was locked, with Mason's car seat still buckled in the back. Officers began a quick sweep of the park, calling Danielle's name, scanning the open fields, the basketball courts, and the walking paths that wound into the trees at the park's edge. Within 30 minutes, a K-9 unit was brought in. The dog picked up a scent near the swing set, but lost it abruptly about 30 yards away, an odd dead end that puzzled both handlers and detectives. Witnesses were interviewed on site. One teenager sitting on a nearby bench scrolling through his phone told officers he had looked up once and seen Danielle pushing Mason, then looked down again. When he glanced up a few minutes later, they were gone. A jogger passing through the park shortly after 3 p.m. reported seeing the stroller unattended, but thought nothing of it at the time. By early evening, as the sun began to dip, uniformed officers expanded the search perimeter. Volunteers arrived, some with flashlights, others with thermal imaging drones. The small pond at the far end of the park was scanned from shore. Officers walked shoulder to shoulder through the open grassy areas, marking each section cleared. But as darkness fell, there were still no signs, no clothing, no footprints, no discarded belongings beyond what had been left by the swing set. Danielle's family arrived at the scene just before nightfall, confusion quickly giving way to panic. Her mother clutched Mason's hat as officers explained what little they knew. Friends called her phone repeatedly, only to hear it ring from inside her purse. The SUV was towed for forensic examination, but detectives admitted quietly to one another that the lack of disturbance around the stroller suggested something sudden and deliberate. By 9 p.m., the park was lit by spotlights, casting long shadows over the playground equipment. The air grew cooler, and the earlier sounds of children's laughter had been replaced by the low hum of generators and the distant barking of search dogs. Every rustle in the brush drew a flashlight beam. Every unmarked footprint in the dirt was photographed. And yet, despite the rapid mobilization, the scene yielded nothing. No trail to follow, no direction to search. That first night ended with officers posting patrol cars at every park entrance and sending volunteers home with instructions to return at first light. The swing set, now taped off, swayed slightly in the evening breeze. The juice cup still sat in the stroller's holder, untouched, its contents now warm. In the surrounding houses, lights stayed on far later than usual, neighbors glancing out their windows toward the park. It was as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting for news that never came. Some officers, walking away from the scene that night, would later admit to feeling unsettled by how quickly and completely Danielle and Mason had vanished. It was as if they had stepped off the frame of reality between two moments in time. And in the morning, when the full-scale search began, that eerie absence would only deepen, becoming the defining feature of a mystery that would haunt Brookfield for years to come. By sunrise, Brookfield Park no longer resembled the peaceful neighborhood space it had been the day before. Patrol cars lined the street, their hoods still beaded with morning dew, and yellow tape flapped lightly in the breeze. A command post had been set up near the parking lot, and the quiet hum of generators mixed with the voices of officers calling out assignments. Search teams fanned out in every direction. Some moved slowly through the grassy fields, probing with long poles. Others disappeared into the narrow tree-lined trails that bordered the park. K-9 units worked methodically. Handlers crouched low as the dogs sniffed the air and ground, occasionally pulling sharply toward a scent before losing it again. One team followed a faint trail that led toward the edge of the park's pond, but the dogs circled and doubled back, unable to fix on a definitive direction. It was unsettling, as though the trail simply ended, evaporating into nothing. By mid-morning, helicopters hovered overhead, their blades chopping the air in steady rhythm. From above, officers scanned the tree canopy, the open soccer fields, and the winding creek that ran just beyond the park. A loudspeaker broadcast Danielle's name, along with a description of her and Mason, urging anyone with information to come forward. Residents in the surrounding streets emerged from their homes, some offering coffee and bottled water to searchers, others staring silently from porches, their faces marked with worry. Volunteers began arriving in steady waves, off-duty firefighters, parents from Mason's daycare, complete strangers who had heard the news on the radio. Each was given a brightly colored vest, a walkie-talkie, and a map divided into grids. They moved in lines, calling Danielle's and Mason's names, bending low to peer into drainage ditches, checking beneath picnic tables, and in the dense hedges near the playground. Every few minutes, someone would stop to lift a shoe, a blanket, or a child's toy, only for an officer to confirm it belonged to someone else. Detectives started canvassing houses that bordered the park. They asked if anyone had noticed unusual vehicles, unfamiliar faces, or loud arguments. Most responses were the same, nothing out of the ordinary. A few recalled seeing Danielle the day before, smiling as Mason ran across the grass. None could recall seeing her leave. The absence of any witnesses in a public place in the middle of the afternoon troubled investigators deeply. By noon, divers were in the pond, working in slow arcs, hands sifting through mud. The water was murky and visibility was poor. They emerged periodically with debris, a rusted bicycle frame, a tangle of fishing line, discarded soda cans. No sign of Danielle or Mason. Inside the command post, detectives pinned photographs of Danielle and Mason to a whiteboard, alongside a map of the park and its surrounding streets. A timeline was drawn in thick black marker. At the top, the last confirmed sighting, 2:45 p.m. at the slide. 20 minutes later, the stroller was found unattended. No one could account for that gap. Theories began to form. One officer suggested a fast, targeted abduction by someone familiar with the park's layout. Another raised the possibility that Danielle had left voluntarily, though there was no evidence she'd prepared to do so. Her purse, car, and phone were all untouched. Neighbors who knew Danielle well were quick to shut down the idea that she'd run away. They described her as devoted to Mason, protective to the point of rarely letting him out of her sight. She had no known enemies, no recent conflicts, and no history of erratic behavior. The more investigators learned about her life, the more the voluntary disappearance theory seemed to crumble. As the day wore on, the search radius expanded beyond the park. Checkpoints were set up on nearby roads, with officers stopping cars and handing out flyers. Trailheads several miles away were searched on the chance that the pair had wandered farther than expected. Drones with thermal imaging scanned thick underbrush that ground teams struggled to penetrate. By late afternoon, heat shimmered off the pavement. Many volunteers were sunburned, their clothes streaked with dirt, but still they combed every corner, drainage pipes, abandoned sheds, even trash bins. And still, there was nothing. No footprints, no torn clothing, no dropped toy, not even a thread of fabric to follow. The lack of disturbance was beginning to weigh on the detectives. In most missing person cases, even the cleanest abductions left behind something. Here, it was as if the world had closed over Danielle and Mason the moment they disappeared. When the sun dipped behind the trees, the searchers gathered back at the park. A few lingered near the swing set, staring at the stroller still sitting where it had been found. Inside, Mason's juice cup had tipped, a small sticky stain marking the seat. Officers took one last sweep before nightfall, their flashlights cutting thin beams through the darkening grass. As the second night closed in, the case was already beginning to fracture in the minds of those involved. Was this the work of a stranger who slipped in and out unseen? Or had someone Danielle knew been waiting for the perfect moment? The questions outnumbered the answers, and the absence of a single clue was becoming the most chilling detail of all. The park, despite the chaos of the search, felt untouched, and that quiet, undisturbed space made it hard to imagine just how two people could vanish from it in broad daylight. Detectives began with the most immediate and statistically likely explanation: the person closest to Danielle. Her recent divorce had been contentious, marked by custody disputes and arguments over visitation schedules for Mason. In the weeks before her disappearance, Danielle and her ex-husband, Jason Rayner, had exchanged several heated text messages, some of which hinted at legal threats. To investigators, this tension was a natural starting point. Jason was brought in for questioning within 48 hours. He appeared guarded but cooperative, providing his phone, bank records, and a detailed account of his whereabouts on the afternoon Danielle vanished. He said he had been working a full shift at the auto repair shop where he'd been employed for years. Surveillance footage from the shop's parking lot and time-stamped work orders backed up his claim. By the third day, detectives were confident enough in his alibi to shift their focus elsewhere, though in the court of public opinion, suspicion lingered. The removal of Jason from the suspect pool left a vacuum, one that was quickly filled with speculation. In the absence of clear evidence, theories began to multiply, each more polarizing than the last. Some neighbors, especially those familiar with the strain Danielle had been under, wondered if she might have taken Mason and left to avoid the ongoing legal battles. They pointed to her tendency to withdraw when stressed and the fact that she hadn't been especially social in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. Others rejected the idea entirely, saying Danielle's devotion to her son was unshakable and that she had no means or preparation to simply vanish. She hadn't withdrawn cash, packed belongings, or contacted any friends or family for help. Those who knew her best argued that the only reason she wouldn't come home was if she physically couldn't. The possibility of a stranger abduction began to take shape in the minds of both investigators and residents. The park bordered a busy road on one side and a wooded trail on the other, routes that could offer a quick escape in multiple directions. Parents started recalling details they'd dismissed at the time: a man in a dark hoodie sitting alone on a bench, a white panel van parked across the street, an unfamiliar couple lingering by the restrooms. None of these leads produced actionable evidence, but the fragments fed into the growing paranoia. In private, detectives weighed every angle. A voluntary disappearance was the least messy on paper, but it didn't account for the personal items left behind, especially the locked car and Mason's car seat. A stranger abduction was possible, but statistically rare in broad daylight, in a semi-populated park, with no witnesses who could confirm seeing the approach or the getaway. A targeted abduction by someone Danielle knew seemed more plausible, someone she trusted enough not to raise alarm. The lack of resolution was beginning to fracture the community. Parents who had once allowed their children to roam the park freely now kept them within arm's reach. Conversations between neighbors carried a sharper edge. Questions about who was really telling the truth circulated like wildfire. Social media became an echo chamber of unverified claims, with some users posting grainy, years-old photos of Danielle as if searching for signs of secret plans in her expression. Meanwhile, the image that haunted everyone, investigators, neighbors, and family alike, was that stroller under the swing set. Photographs of it, taken by crime scene technicians in the first hours of the investigation, had already made their way into the press. The bright fabric seat, the purse still hanging from the handle, the small juice cup tipped in its holder. It had become a symbol of the case, a silent witness to whatever had happened in those 20 minutes. For detectives, the stroller was both a piece of evidence and a psychological focal point. They studied the crime scene photos, looking for signs of disturbance around its wheels, anything to suggest it had been moved or knocked over. The dirt beneath it was unmarked, the grass barely flattened, as if Danielle had stepped away with the intention of coming right back. That single detail gnawed at investigators. Whatever pulled her and Mason away had done so with remarkable speed and without visible struggle. Theories would continue to splinter the town in the days and weeks to come, dividing those who believed Danielle had chosen to disappear from those who were certain she had been taken. But in the evidence room, among the files and photographs, one truth was undeniable. The stroller was still there, frozen in time, long after its owner and her child had vanished without a trace. And with each day that passed, the odds of finding them alive seemed to grow thinner. The search had stretched into its third day when a potential lead surfaced, one that immediately shifted focus to the far end of Brookfield Park. K9 handlers reported that two of the dogs, working separate passes, had followed a scent trail from the playground's edge down a sloping path toward the pond. The trail ended abruptly at the muddy banks, as if whatever trace of Danielle and Mason existed there had dissolved into the water. It was enough to warrant a full-scale search of the pond, and before noon, divers from the county's search and rescue unit were suiting up. The pond wasn't large, but it was murky and unpredictable, its bottom littered with branches, thick mud, and decades of debris from park-goers. Divers moved in slow, careful arcs, their gloved hands sweeping through the sediment. Each time they surfaced, their gear was slick with algae, and their nets heavy with discarded objects, a rusted scooter, a deflated football, tangled fishing line. Every find brought a flicker of attention from the waiting officers on shore, only for that hope to collapse when it was clear the items had no connection to Danielle or Mason. Meanwhile, officers on the banks combed through the reeds and undergrowth, searching for any piece of clothing or sign of a struggle. They found nothing. No shoe, no blanket, no broken branches to suggest someone had been forced into the water. The lack of evidence only deepened the mystery. If the scent trail truly ended at the pond, how could there be no trace of them in it? In an effort to widen the scope, detectives began reviewing surveillance footage from every possible vantage point around the park. The main parking lot had no cameras, but several nearby. Businesses did. Gas stations, convenience stores, and even a private residence offered up recordings from the afternoon of the disappearance. Hours were spent analyzing each frame, looking for Danielle's silver SUV or any pedestrian matching her description. It was during this review that investigators identified a troubling detail. There was a stretch of roughly 20 minutes, beginning just after 2:45 p.m., in which no camera captured Danielle, Mason, or anyone who could be them. In every other window of time, there were cars, joggers, and families moving in and out of view. But in that gap, the cameras seemed to miss them entirely, as if they had slipped into a pocket of the park, invisible to the outside world. Theories began to form in the minds of the detectives. Perhaps they had left by a route not covered by cameras, though that would mean using a path less traveled, possibly toward the woods beyond the pond. Another possibility was that someone had moved them quickly and deliberately during that 20-minute window, using knowledge of the park's blind spots to their advantage. By evening, the pond search was officially called off. The lead diver reported that the entire floor had been mapped and cleared, with no human remains or belongings found. It was a blow to the investigation. This had been the first concrete direction since the initial search, and it had yielded nothing but frustration. Back at the command post, detectives exchanged quiet words with each other, careful not to let the gathered volunteers hear their doubts. Off record, some admitted that the scent trail could have been misleading. Dogs could pick up residual traces from earlier visits Danielle and Mason had made to the park on other days. Others believed the pond still held significance, not because they had been in it, but because it marked a turning point in the search. Beyond it lay less traveled ground, a web of wooded trails and residential backyards that could conceal movement without drawing attention. For Danielle's family, the lack of results from the pond was both a relief and a torment. Relief that no bodies had been recovered. Torment because it meant there was still no clear direction, no proof of life, and no closure. That night, as the searchlights were shut down and the volunteers went home, the police were left with the same gnawing uncertainty they had started the day with. The pond's surface was still, reflecting the dim orange glow of the street lamps at the park's edge. It had given up nothing, no evidence, no answers. And for investigators, that absence raised the most unsettling possibility of all. Danielle and Mason might never have left the park alive. But if that was true, then somewhere within its boundaries was a secret that had been overlooked. And until it was found, the case would remain as murky as the water they had just spent hours searching. By the time the first frost settled over Brookfield, the urgency that had once surrounded Danielle and Mason's disappearance had begun to lose its grip on the town. In the early weeks, every telephone pole within a 5-mile radius had carried their faces. Danielle smiling in a candid photo, Mason's round cheeks and curious eyes staring out from a grainy daycare picture. Now those same flyers had curled at the edges, the ink fading under months of wind, rain, and sunlight. Some had been covered over by advertisements for garage sales and community events. The missing persons notices pushed further down the boards as if the town itself was unconsciously moving on. The vigils continued for a while, candles flickering in the cool autumn evenings. At first, dozens of people came, neighbors, old classmates, even strangers from nearby towns. They'd gather at the park lining the fence near the swing set where Danielle's stroller had been found. But as the weeks turned into months, the crowds thinned. By December, only a handful of the most dedicated remained, huddled together in heavy coats, their breath visible in the cold night air as they stood in silence. Inside the police department, the investigation had changed hands. The detectives who had been there from day one, who had walked the fields and stood at the pond's edge, were reassigned to newer cases. In their place came the cold case unit, investigators who brought fresh eyes but also carried the quiet pragmatism that comes from years of unsolved files. They sifted through the evidence again, reread interviews, and rechecked the timeline. But without a body, without witnesses, and without any significant leads, there was only so much they could do. Frustrated with the slow progress, Danielle's parents hired a private investigator named Mark Eldon. He was a former detective with a reputation for persistence. Eldon visited the park multiple times, walking the same routes Danielle might have taken, stopping at the edges of the playground to study sightlines and blind spots. He reviewed the scent trail data from the K-9 units and examined the 20-minute gap in surveillance footage, convinced that the answer had to be hidden in those early moments. He told the family that in cases like this, the first hour was everything. Something had happened in that narrow window that either no one saw or someone wasn't telling. Eldon interviewed neighbors and park visitors again, hoping the time might loosen memories or consciences. He heard familiar accounts. Danielle pushing Mason on the swing, Mason's hat lying in the grass. But nothing new emerged. A few people admitted to seeing unfamiliar vehicles parked on side streets in the weeks before the disappearance, but without plates or clear descriptions, the details went nowhere. As winter deepened, the case began to settle into the background hum of small-town life. People still talked about it, but now it was more in passing, folded into conversations like a shared ghost story. Kids would dare each other to swing on the same swing set after dark, whispering about the mom and boy who vanished. Parents still kept a closer eye on their children, but the fear had dulled into habit. For the family, the fading public attention was a new kind of pain. In the beginning, it had felt like the whole town was with them, pushing forward, determined to bring Danielle and Mason home. Now, they felt like they were standing in that park alone, the cold wind cutting across the empty playground. Christmas came and went without a word, without a sign. Danielle's parents kept the lights in her house on, as if she might walk back through the door at any moment. The swing set where the stroller had been found remained in place, though the ground beneath it was now hardened by frost. Sometimes, in the stillness of the early morning, joggers passing through the park would slow as they approached it, their eyes drawn involuntarily to that spot. Even without the police tape, it was marked, a place where something had happened, and yet no one could explain what. By February, the investigation had no new leads, no new evidence, and no new hope. It had become one of those cases that people still mentioned in the same breath as other local mysteries, the kind that linger unsolved for decades. But for Danielle's parents, and for the few who still lit candles at the fence, it was not a story or a legend. It was an open wound, and in the quiet of that first winter, they began to realize that without a break in the case, the truth might never come to light. In the years that followed, the case never truly closed, but it drifted in and out of the public eye like a shadow that refused to fade completely. Every so often, a new tip would surface, just enough to reignite a flicker of hope, only to be extinguished by the cold weight of reality. One of the first came from a truck driver in Illinois who swore he'd seen a woman matching Danielle's description at a rest stop along Interstate 55. She'd had a young child with her, roughly Mason's age at the time, and seemed nervous, glancing over her shoulder as they walked toward the vending machines. Investigators pursued the lead, pulling surveillance footage from the rest stop. The grainy images showed a woman and child, but the distance, poor lighting, and pixelation made identification impossible. When other witnesses who had been there were interviewed, their descriptions conflicted. In the end, the footage was filed away, inconclusive and unsatisfying. Months later, a tip came from Oklahoma. A clerk at a gas station reported seeing a woman with a small boy late at night. Something about her had struck him as odd. She paid for her gas in cash, avoided conversation, and left quickly. The station's security cameras provided a short, blurry clip. The woman's build and hair color were similar to Danielle's, but a closer look revealed details that didn't match. Different facial structure. The boy slightly older than Mason would have been. Another lead crossed off the board. Over time, these false sightings became a cruel cycle for Danielle's parents. Each one brought an initial surge of hope, followed by a familiar, crushing disappointment. Their interviews with the press grew harder to watch. In the first year, they spoke clearly, their words carrying determination. By the third year, their voices had softened, their eyes heavier, as if each question pulled them deeper into exhaustion. Still, they agreed to every interview, every podcast, every TV special that might keep the case alive. They understood that fading from public memory would only make finding Danielle and Mason harder. Meanwhile, Brookfield Park began to change. Renovations were made, new benches installed, fresh mulch laid around the playground. The bathrooms were updated, and new lighting was added along the walking trails. Yet, despite all the upgrades, the original swing set remained. Its chains were replaced and the frame was repainted, but it was still the same set where Danielle had last been seen with Mason. For many in town, it was a silent monument to what had happened, though most avoided speaking of it directly. Life in Brookfield moved forward in small, gradual ways. The families who had been at the park that day watched their children grow into teenagers. New families moved in, many unaware of the disappearance until they stumbled across an old newspaper article or heard it whispered in conversation. But for Danielle's family, time felt like it was standing still. Every change in season became another mark in the tally, another reminder that years were passing without answers. The case files grew thicker, but not richer. Every tip was logged, every rumor tracked, but most led nowhere. Investigators who had once been assigned full-time to the case now had other priorities. Occasionally, the file would land on a new detective's desk, and for a few weeks there would be a burst of activity. Calls to old witnesses, re-examination of evidence, perhaps even another public appeal. Then the momentum would fade, the case slipping back into the background. For the family, the absence became a presence of its own. Holidays were the hardest. Christmas came with an empty chair and unopened gifts that were quietly put away. Birthdays passed with no candles to blow out. Each year, Mason's age was recalculated. How tall he might be now, what sports he might have played, the sound of his voice as it would have changed. Danielle's friends tried to stay in touch with her parents, but over time, many drifted away, unsure of what to say anymore. Even with the park's changes, that swing set remained untouched in its meaning. People still glanced at it as they walked by, some with a pang of sadness, others with a vague unease they couldn't quite name. And for those who remembered that day, the image of it, stroller parked beneath, purse, hanging from the handle, juice cup still half full, was never far from mind. It was the last known proof that Danielle and Mason had been there at all. The years did not erase the questions, they only made them sharper. If Danielle had left on her own, why had she abandoned everything in the stroller? If someone had taken them, how had it been done so quickly, in daylight, without a single witness seeing a thing? The town might have adapted to living without answers, but for Danielle's family, every sunrise was a reminder that the countdown had no end. And somewhere, they believed, the truth was still out there, buried under the weight of time, waiting for someone to uncover it. It was a warm afternoon in early May, 5 years to the month since Danielle and Mason had vanished. The park had changed since then, but the surrounding woods remained much the same, quiet, dense in places, with narrow trails twisting away from the main paths. About 2 miles from where the playground stood, a man named Robert Hale was out walking his German Shepherd along one of those lesser-known trails. He'd taken the route dozens of times before, enjoying the solitude it offered. That day, however, his dog suddenly froze, ears pricking forward before bolting into the undergrowth. Robert called after him, but the dog didn't come back right away. When it finally emerged, its jaws carried something small and pale. At first glance, Robert thought it was just an old piece of fabric or a chewed-up toy. But as he reached down and took it from the dog, he realized it was a child's shoe. Tiny, scuffed, the colors faded almost completely. One side was torn, and the fabric was stiff with age. The sight of it sent a chill through him. He knew about the disappearance of Danielle and Mason. Everyone in Brookfield did. Without hesitating, he clipped the dog's leash and pushed through the brush toward where the animal had been digging. The ground there was uneven, a patch of loose soil beneath a tangle of roots. Kneeling down, Robert noticed the edge of something white jutting just above the dirt. With his fingers, he brushed away the top layer, and the curve of a small bone began to emerge. His stomach turned. He stood up quickly, backed away, and dialed 911. Within minutes, the quiet woods were filled with the distant wail of sirens. When police arrived, they immediately cordoned off the area, keeping Robert at a distance while forensic teams moved in. The discovery site was treated with extreme caution, photographs taken, soil samples collected, every inch documented before any evidence was removed. As more earth was cleared, it became apparent that the remains were partial, scattered in a way that suggested they had not been undisturbed over the years. Alongside the bones, investigators recovered fragments of fabric. One piece was identified almost instantly by detectives who had worked the original case. It matched the pattern of the small blanket Danielle had been carrying for Mason that day. The next step was confirmation. The remains were sent for DNA analysis, with a rush order placed on the testing. For Danielle's parents, the call came just days later. The results were conclusive. The bones belonged to Mason Rayner. Hearing it confirmed what they had feared for years, yet the manner of the discovery brought more questions than closure. The trail where Robert had been walking was not new. It had been part of the original search grid back in 2018. Searchers, including K-9 teams, had covered it repeatedly in those first weeks. If Mason's remains had been there all along, how had every search missed them? And if they hadn't been there at the time, who had put them there later? Investigators struggled with the implications. The location was close enough to the park to be reached on foot in less than an hour, but remote enough that someone could have come and gone without being seen. If the remains had been moved, it suggested that whoever was responsible for Mason's death, or at least the concealment of his body, had either stayed in the area or returned years later, risking exposure. The reason for doing so was unclear. It could have been an attempt to stage the discovery, to send a message, or simply the act of someone no longer able to keep the secret buried. The announcement of the discovery brought the case back into the public eye overnight. News crews returned to Brookfield, their cameras focusing on the wooded path now blocked by police tape. Residents who had tried to put the case behind them found themselves drawn into conversation about it once again. Old suspicions resurfaced and theories multiplied. For Danielle's family, the grief was compounded by the absence of her remains. If Mason had been found, why not her? The possibility that she was still alive was raised, but for many, the years without contact made that hope difficult to hold on to. Detectives kept the details of the find close, releasing only what they felt would help generate new leads. But inside the department, there was quiet acknowledgement that this discovery had shifted the investigation into more unsettling territory. The idea that someone had been able to return to a previously searched area, undetected, raised uncomfortable questions about proximity, opportunity, and familiarity with the search efforts. That small, faded shoe, carried out of the woods in the jaws of a dog, had broken open a case that had been dormant for years. Yet, instead of bringing resolution, it had deepened the mystery. Mason's partial remains were now in police custody, but the story of how they ended up in that patch of dirt remained untold. And somewhere, in the silence that followed, the question took root. If the area had been searched before, then when, and more importantly, why, had he been placed there at all? The wooded clearing where Mason's partial remains were found quickly transformed into a controlled excavation site. Crime scene tape stretched in a wide perimeter, and uniformed officers stood guard at every entry point. Forensic specialists worked slowly, using small trowels, brushes, and sifters to remove soil one layer at a time. Every handful was examined for fibers, bone fragments, or anything that could connect the discovery to the day Danielle and Mason vanished. Within hours, a technician uncovered something partially embedded in the dirt, a small scrap of faded fabric. When the soil was brushed away, the pattern became visible. It was light blue, decorated with tiny white clouds, the edges frayed and worn. Detectives on scene recognized it immediately. It matched the blanket Danielle had been carrying in her arms when witnesses last saw her in the park. Photos from that day, circulated during the original search, showed Mason wrapped in it while sitting in his stroller. The discovery was more than just another piece of evidence. It was confirmation that this was the place where at least some part of the truth had been hidden. For the rest of the afternoon, the search continued under the shade of the trees. More fragments of the blanket were found, each one logged and bagged for analysis. But as the hours passed, it became clear that no other human remains were present. The search expanded outward, radiating from the original find site, but yielded nothing belonging to Danielle. It was an unsettling result. The assumption had always been that mother and son had met the same fate together. Finding Mason without Danielle raised the question no one wanted to voice. Had she died elsewhere, or could she still be alive? Investigators began to consider the possibility that Mason's remains had not been in this location for the full 5 years. The area had been searched in the early days, thoroughly enough that something like a blanket would have been noticed. That led to a troubling theory, that someone had moved his remains after the fact, possibly from another location, and placed them here deliberately. The act could have been intended to confuse investigators, to taunt them, or to shift suspicion away from the real location of the crime. The media wasted no time in seizing on the most chilling version of events. News segments debated whether the person responsible had kept Mason's remains hidden for years before deciding to return them, and why they would choose a spot so close to where the disappearance had occurred. Some speculated it was a sign of arrogance, a way for the killer to reinsert themselves into the narrative without exposing their identity. Others wondered if it was an emotional decision, someone who had been unable to let go, finally giving up their secret, but only partially. The renewed attention brought cameras back to Brookfield. Reporters stood outside the park's entrance, broadcasting updates live, their voices lowered as they gestured toward the tree line. Satellite trucks parked along the roadside, and neighbors found themselves approached for interviews yet again. For some, it was an unwelcome reopening of wounds they had tried to heal. For Danielle's parents, it was both a small breakthrough and a cruel reminder of the unanswered questions that still loomed. Behind the scenes, detectives compiled a list of anyone with access to the wooded area in the last few years: maintenance crews, hunters, hikers, and even former search volunteers. They also revisited old suspects, checking alibis against the possibility that someone could have moved the remains long after the initial search had ended. The complexity of the timeline made it difficult to narrow down, and every new theory seemed to branch into two more. As daylight faded, the excavation site was carefully closed down. Evidence bags containing the blanket fragments were taken to the lab, along with soil samples that might hold trace evidence, fibers, hair, or even pollen that could indicate where the items had been stored before ending up here. Mason's remains were transported under police escort for further forensic examination, though investigators already knew the limitations. After 5 years, the determining an exact cause of death would be extremely difficult, if not impossible. Standing at the edge of the taped-off clearing, one detective quietly acknowledged to a colleague that this discovery, for all its weight, had brought them no closer to finding Danielle. If anything, it had deepened the mystery. The blanket and remains told them that Mason had been here recently, but the absence of Danielle suggested her story had taken a different path entirely. And so the most haunting question of all settled over the investigation. If someone had held on to Mason's remains for years before returning them, what had they done with Danielle? And why had they chosen now to give back only part of the truth? The discovery of Mason's remains sent shockwaves through Brookfield, tearing open wounds the town had tried to let heal. Within days, detectives were retracing every step from the original investigation. Old witness lists were pulled from dusty case files, and people who hadn't thought about that day in years suddenly found officers at their doors again. Some recounted the same stories they had told in 2018, their memories frozen in time. Danielle pushing Mason on the swing, the stroller under the set, the sudden absence. Others admitted they remembered little now, details blurred and uncertain after 5 years. Detectives also returned to familiar names, starting with Jason Rayner, Danielle's ex-husband. Though he had been cleared early on with a strong alibi, the unsettling fact that his son's remains had been found so close to the original scene warranted another look. He was brought in for fresh questioning, his prior statements compared line by line against his new account. Investigators examined whether he could have had any opportunity in the years since to access the area and plant the remains, though nothing concrete emerged to tie him to the discovery. Still, the renewed scrutiny rekindled old suspicions among some residents, even as others insisted he was being unfairly dragged back into the spotlight. Search teams were mobilized again, combing the park and the woods beyond in wide sweeps. Areas already searched in the past were covered again, this time with a sharper focus. Trails branching off from the clearing where Mason's bones had been found were walked in overlapping grids, drones scanning the treetops and undergrowth for signs of disturbed soil or concealed objects. Metal detectors swept the ground in hopes of finding jewelry, keys, or any metallic trace that might link to Danielle. But each pass came back empty. No sign of her. No sign of anything that could tell investigators how Mason had died or where his mother had gone. The forensics report on Mason's remains was as frustrating as it was grim. Time and environmental exposure had erased most evidence of trauma, leaving the cause of death officially undetermined. There was no way to say if he had died from injury, exposure, or something else entirely. The blanket fragments found with him confirmed he had been moved after his death, but nothing indicated when or by whom. As the investigation stalled again, the community's collective narrative began to fracture. In online forums and casual conversations, residents split into camps. One group believed Danielle had died alongside her son and that her body was still hidden somewhere nearby. They argued that no mother would willingly leave her child's body in the woods and remain silent for years. The other group clung to the possibility that she was alive, perhaps abducted, perhaps forced into hiding, or even complicit in some way. For them, the absence of her remains was proof of survival, not death. The family lived caught between both possibilities, unable to lean fully toward either without betraying the memory of their daughter or grandson. Danielle's parents spoke sparingly to the media now. When they did, their words carried the weight of exhaustion, grateful for the small piece of truth they'd been given, but tormented by the void that remained. They described it as being handed a puzzle with most of the pieces missing, forced to stare at the incomplete picture every day. In town, the park became a place of quiet tension. Some residents avoided it entirely, feeling it was tainted. Others continued to bring their children, determined not to let fear define the space. The swing set remained, its bright paint doing nothing to soften the shadow it cast over those who remembered. People walking the nearby trails sometimes found themselves glancing toward the clearing where Mason had been found, wondering if the person who put him there had ever stood in that same spot, watching unseen. Behind the walls of the police department, detectives worked through the dwindling leads, aware that public pressure was mounting again. Without new evidence, they could not move the case forward, yet the unsolved nature of Danielle's fate made it impossible to close. It sat in a limbo that was as frustrating for law enforcement as it was agonizing for the family. For the Rayners, the discovery had changed everything and nothing all at once. They had their grandson's remains, a place to grieve, a grave to visit. But there was no answer to the larger question. What had happened in those missing minutes 5 years ago? Until that truth emerged, the case would remain a story with two halves, one written in painful certainty, the other in silence. And the silence was, in many ways, the harder part to live with. The investigation into Danielle and Mason Rayner's disappearance had always been fragile, sustained by small bursts of hope that rarely lasted. After the discovery of Mason's remains, it felt like the case might finally push toward resolution. But as weeks turned into months with no further evidence, the momentum slowed until it stopped completely. Leads dried up. Witnesses who had been re-interviewed had nothing new to offer. And the unsettling truth became harder to ignore. Without a confession or a new eyewitness, the trail had gone cold again. Mason's remains were released to the family that summer. The funeral was small, held in a quiet cemetery on the outskirts of town. A handful of relatives and close friends gathered under a gray sky, the sound of wind moving through the trees filling the silences between prayers. His casket was small, far smaller than anyone wanted to see, and rested beneath a spray of white flowers. Danielle's parents stood together, holding on to each other's arms, their faces lined with the grief of 5 years without answers. There was no matching grave beside his. For them, the emptiness where her name should be was almost as unbearable as losing her. After the service, detectives stayed in touch with the family, though their updates became infrequent. Off the record, some admitted they might never solve the case without someone coming forward. Too much time had passed. The physical evidence was minimal and degraded. Theories remained just that, possibilities without proof. The dog's discovery of Mason's shoe and remains was still the last meaningful break in the investigation, and even that had only deepened the mystery. It was a cruel reality. The moment that had reopened the case also reminded everyone that answers could appear years later and still leave the most important question untouched. Around Brookfield, life continued. The park where it began still stood, its paths and benches familiar to those who had walked them for decades. The playground equipment had been repaired and repainted, but the swing set where Danielle was last seen remained in place. On most days, it was just another piece of the scenery. Children played there again, their laughter ringing out in the open air. But for those who knew the story, the site carried a weight that never faded. Parents watched their children more closely. Some avoided the park altogether, unwilling to walk past the place where a young mother and her son had vanished without a trace. Over the years, whispers persisted. Some claimed to have seen a woman who looked like Danielle in another town, in another state, but none of the sightings were ever confirmed. Others believed she had died that same day as Mason, her body buried somewhere still hidden from view. In the absence of definitive answers, people built their own conclusions, piecing together fragments into whatever narrative felt most possible to them. For Danielle's parents, the days often felt like a slow march between anniversaries, birthdays, holidays, the date of their disappearance. They marked the passage of time not by seasons, but by how long it had been since they had last seen her smile or heard Mason's voice. They visited his grave regularly, leaving flowers and small toys. Danielle's name, however, remained absent from any headstone, a silent vow that until they knew the truth, they would not lay her to rest. The park became part of that ritual too. On certain days, they would stop there, sitting on a bench within sight of the swing set. It was rarely busy in the early mornings, and the stillness allowed them to imagine, for just a moment, that the place might give something back, a memory, a clue, anything. Locals sometimes said that in the quiet, when the wind moved just right, you could hear the faint echo of a child's laughter drifting across the grass. Most dismissed it as nothing more than the sound of other children playing in the distance, but for those who carried the memory of Danielle and Mason, it felt like a reminder that the story was still unfinished, and that was the hardest truth for everyone connected to the case. Mason's discovery had provided a piece of the puzzle, but the larger picture remained missing. Danielle's fate was a question left hanging in the air, unanswered and unrelenting. The investigation was still officially open, but its file sat on a shelf among other cold cases, waiting for the one moment, a confession, a witness, a forgotten piece of evidence that could bring the final piece of the story to light. Until that day came, Brookfield would remain a town with a shadow hanging over it, a place where the story of a mother and son's disappearance ended not with closure, but with silence.